Welcome. This is David Bowles, Human Meme. Today's topic, legally deaf. Well, there really isn't a legal, written into the law sort of idea that explicitly defines what deafness is and what deafness does and what deafness means when it comes to restricting a deaf person's right to exist in an open society. And sure, you can do a test to learn how much hearing a person has lost and then seek some veiled protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Or you may dive into a Social Security means and objectivity test for some sort of support and payment. But the only job the deaf are officially barred from having is that of a pilot for an airplane. And perhaps on some level, some public safety professions that rely on spoken wireless communication. Now, blindness, on the other hand, has a pejorative definition ensconced in the law, where one can in fact be declared legally blind and then not be licensed to drive a car, and may face driving restrictions as to time of day depending on the magnitude of the loss of sight. And I also suppose the blind cannot be an airplane pilot. Meanwhile, the deaf are all driving cars all day, no restrictions. Well, in some states, the deaf are required to have deaf printed on their driver's license, and some other states want mandatory side mirrors for deaf drivers, but there's really no federal statute out there limiting the to and fro of deaf transportation. And I happily accept all arguments for and against what I just said, but I'm setting the table for a grander idea that leaps from this experience. I recently attended a meeting of middle-aged deaf folk in New York City. And attending were professional advocates for the deaf who were tired of being ignored by the system and who wanted more money and more respect in deaf society. And there was a mix of hearing and deaf people. One deaf professional wanted a commission for the deaf, since there is a commission for the blind. And that comment got me to thinking about definitions and disability and waves of the future. The people attending the deaf advocacy meeting were worried about the loss of community and the loss of services. One person said instead of having 12 counselors to serve all 5 boroughs for the deaf in New York City, that number is now 2. And everyone at the meeting outraged. 12 to 2. How could that be? What happened? Well, how could that be? Perhaps because counselor services are not as necessary anymore, due to the lack of interest in mainstream interest in the public school system. Budget cutting and resource limitations are a real thing. But if there's enough outrage and demand, things can and will change. But when there's no outburst, well, then interest and advocacy dissipates. Because it slowly becomes clear to those paying attention that you are advocating more for yourself and your own self-interest than that of the people you claim to serve and the community you want to be a part of. It's a problem when there is a lack of perceived need. States, cities run on emergencies. They do not care about status quo. They are all in favor of neutral. And my human mean friend, as I sat there listening and learning about research, data mining, and corrections made to the numbers, and corruption, and all the complaining against the system they were supposed to be serving, I realized everyone in that room was actively asking the wrong question. They were asking why this happened, when they should have been asking what happened. And they were doing that because why is a victim word, while what often leads to the truth. And so here is the truth of that matter, unboxed. The question that should have been asked, what happened, requires this answer. The parents do not care. If you claim you want advocacy for the deaf, you have to start with the children, the deaf children, and their parents. The deaf children are in school. They have needs. They have to be provided for and cared for by the system. Deaf children must be educated as part of the social contract that all citizens have with the state. Deaf children must be encouraged to learn and to appreciate their language, American Sign Language. But there is and has been a big change in the deaf community when it comes to children born deaf to hearing parents, and most deaf children are born to hearing parents. And this change has actually rapidly happened over the last 30 years. And that change is a medical intervention to fix a deaf child by surgical implantation, a cochlear implant. Deafness is fixed, right? No need for American Sign Language. These deaf children will now speak perfectly and verbally in English. Let the deaf be deaf, right? Wrong. No deaf child shall survive, not when medicine can intervene to save the day. Save the day while destroying the culture and dismissing the language of the deaf. Implant those deaf kids as infants, cochlear implants, and they're done. No more deafness. No more American Sign Language interpreters needed. No more deaf kids to burden the educational system. The state saves money. They slash budgets. They reduce counselors for the deaf from 12 to 2 for all 5 boroughs of New York City. Except it doesn't quite work that way. Deafness doesn't mean a person is broken. If deaf kids choose to want a cochlear implant and to learn American Sign Language as well, let the kids decide. It's their life. Let the kids decide when the age is right that they want or do not want the implantation. Give them the chance to live out the life of who they were born to be. And in the meantime, allow them their language and let them have access to the deaf community. But no, the doctors will tell you, no, for speech reasons. The cochlear implant surgery must be done at 4 months of age, not at 14 years of age. And no American Sign Language, because a manual language is a crutch that disassociates the deaf from the hearing world and compresses experience. And there you have it. Time is of the essence. Before the deaf child is able to develop and think on their own and becomes a part of deaf culture, with ASL as the main means of communication, and the deaf child can think on its own, the deaf have a different way of interacting with the world through their eyes and not their ears. The deaf are beautiful, visual beings. However, hearing parents want their children, their deaf children, to be just like them, not people of their own. They want their kids allegedly healthy and whole and fixed and hearing. And so these desperate, narcissistic parents, along with assistance from the doctors, decide to fix all these deaf children, deaf infants, really, with cochlear implantation. And those kids, those implanted kids, grow up without a culture. They are boxed in, but boxless. Those kids are not allowed to be part of the deaf community. And they'll never really be a part of the deaf community anyway. And even with this cochlear implantation, those deaf kids will never really be a part of the hearing community either. A part, yes, but a part of, no. And you don't have to believe me. You can ask those kids, those implanted kids, as they age and grow older. You can ask them yourself. Ask them what they're a part of. Ask them where their human identity lives. And you're not going to be told they are hearing and living in the hearing community, because they are not. Even though their doctors and their parents tell them they are now hearing, they are now healed. But these implanted children are abandoned and unable to forget. And their core language of origin, American Sign Language, has been disallowed by professionals and those who claim to know better. So, now that we've asked and answered the what question, what happened? Now we can go back and ask why this happened, the what happened, and we already sort of can intuit that answer now too, by taking the extra step of asking just one more question. One more question to those hearing parents with cochlear implanted deaf children who were born deaf but not allowed to be deaf. And the question for those hearing parents is simply this: do you have deaf children? Are your children deaf? And I guarantee you 100% of those hearing parents of implanted deaf children will answer you in this way: no, my child is not deaf. But your child was born deaf and then changed, fixed by medical intervention, surgery, implantation of a cochlear implant as an infant. So is your child now hearing? No, my child is not deaf. Now, my human meme friend, those hearing parents may intellectually understand on some level that deafness is a culture with its own values and language and not just a medical condition that needs to be fixed. But they don't want that for their child. No, their child is special and is actually hearing and not deaf, never deaf, because of implantation. And deep inside their emotional hearts, those hearing parents pray their deaf children will no longer be deaf at all. Ignore it, and it shall be. No language? Okay, be illiterate, as long as you are hearing and not deaf. And why is this? Why do hearing parents of deaf children want their deaf children to be hearing? They want this because the medical community has convinced those parents to implant their infant offspring with medical devices to cure their deafness. And yes, those kids will eventually tell you they are not hearing. They understand that later on in life because they know better. And because they will and do live against the discrimination every day of not really hearing, even though they pretend to be hearing cochlear implant or not, wanting American Sign Language to communicate their needs and wishes and hopes and dreams or not. So now we have this larger problem. The sorrow no longer belongs or fits in the box. Those deaf kids are stuck in hearing families, left out, and those deaf kids have parents who don't want them to identify as deaf. And the deaf implanted kids can't identify as hearing, so what are they? Where are their friends? What forms their culture? Are they the implanted, the lost generation? Are they hard of hearing? Hearing impaired? And that hearing impaired label is now legally banned, by the way, in New York State. Because, the theory goes, hearing impaired is considered a discriminatory label. But making a deaf infant hearing through surgery is not discriminatory in the eyes of New York State or anyone else, it seems. And that surgery is just fine because doctors. So what are those cochlear implanted kids called by their peers, their friends, and the people they associate with in the classroom? And since deafness is usually an invisible disability, but cochlear implants are distractingly visually identifiable and sort of painful to look at if you think about it, think about what happened. An example. Imagine 3 people walking down the street together but not talking to each other, saying nothing. A deaf person, a blind person, and a cochlear implanted person. You would not know just by looking at them that the deaf person was deaf. But you'd see the cochlear implant shining in the sun. And you'd probably see the blind person using a cane or a dog in order to navigate the street. So how should society and the educational system handle these abandoned, cultural-less, cochlear implanted deaf children? The invisible, but the visibly shaken. And that's the real question. To ask back that question after we found the right questions to answer. Can we allow deaf children to live and celebrate their language? Can we reverse medical history and return a lost culture back into a safe box? If hearing parents are not letting their deaf-born kids identify as deaf, even if they have cochlear implants, well, then any idea of a commission for the deaf will not and cannot survive the moment of exasperation of the older and wizened deaf community. That community were never implanted as children, and they have no interest in ever being cochlear implanted. So there is not only a generational disconnection, but a cultural severing. A severing made irreconcilable and irreversible by involuntary surgery put upon deaf children and deaf infants by those who are supposed to protect them. And so, is all hope lost for the future of the deaf, as a culture, as a language, as a way of knowing? No, not lost. Preservation and active use of the language of the deaf keeps everything alive. Alive for the cochlear implanted deaf, who will seek a return to the culture in which they were born, to escape the box. And it's a pure fact that American Sign Language programs are still wildly popular in universities all over the United States. American Sign Language can be used for a variety of communication disorders. And several years ago, my wife Jana and I wrote a book about just that. Side note, go to bowlesbooks.com, choose Sociology, and look for a book called this, American Sign Language Level 5, a field guide for advanced communication techniques for people with other disabilities. Plus, we will always have deafness in the world in one form or another for at least another 100 years. And the deaf, who are born that way, who are allowed and who are able to stay that way, will use sign language to communicate. Also, immigration is a major factor in protecting deaf culture, because the foreign-born deaf will keep American Sign Language alive in the United States for many more generations because of economies of scale, poverty, and dismay. The foreign-born deaf cannot afford to pay $80,000 for cochlear implant surgery, and they don't have insurance to pay for it either. So yes, there is hope for the deaf community, if we know where to look, and if we always work to ask and answer the right questions. Are your children who were born deaf still deaf? If not, why not? And what not? And if not, why not ask your deaf children who were born that way? Ask them, if you dare. Ask them in 10 or 20 years. Ask them after they were involuntarily cochlear implanted. Ask them if they identify as deaf or as hearing or as something else. You might just be surprised by the answer. And no amount of surgical intervention can ever put that particular rage back in the box. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.